This woman got the fright of her life when she heard whispers and ruffling sounds during the night. She noticed that her garden was being invaded by people who did not belong there. When she finally caught the perpetrators, she stood face to face with these 4 young boys. But when she realized what these boys had done, she bursts into tears. Before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Jane lived alone in the small bungalow at the end of Pine Street. She had seen the world change around her as decades passed. Now, it was rows of houses and apartments filled with people who barely made eye contact, let alone exchange pleasantries. But Jane was okay with it. She was not just okay with it, she actually preferred it that way. She was the only one in her family who never found a husband or had children of her own. Jana was 72 years of age now and spent most of her time tending her garden. "There are days when you just don't see anyone," Jane said. And that wasn't strange, because Jane lived 3 miles from the nearest house. But her quiet and solitary life was about to be turned completely around. The first time she noticed something, it was about 5 o'clock in the morning. Whispering voices and ruffling through the bushes were hearable through her bedroom window. Jane jolted out of her slumber, her frail heart pounding. But as the seconds ticked by, the reality of her situation dawned upon her. Maybe it's just a dream, she mused, her heart still beating fast. She dismissed the earlier noises as part of her dream, but then she heard it again. As she neared it, the sounds became clearer. There were indistinct murmurs and a sound of hurried steps, faint but definitely there. Squinting into the darkness outside, she could see nothing amiss. The sounds abruptly stopped, but she heard quick paces leaving her property, fading into the distance. Next day, it was quiet in her garden. It was clear that these intruders invaded at night. So she devised a plan. During the day, Jane was busy arming her beloved garden into a formidable battleground. She took her old shovel and started to dig holes strategically around the mysterious pit. Each hole was carefully concealed with twigs and leaves, then seamlessly covered with grass mats. As the sun began to set, Jane hung multiple lines around the garden, stringing them with small bells she'd found in the attic. That night, Jane settled into her favorite armchair by the window. Just as the night was at its darkest and the hands of the clock hit 5, the sound of bells echoed through the silence. Jane's heart jumped. She pushed herself off the chair. Jane could hear the muffled sounds of confusion. Curses whispered into the night as the intruders stumbled into her pits. She grabbed her baseball bat and walked outside with a confidence she hadn't felt before. "Who's there?" she shouted into the night, her voice clear and commanding. Then she saw it, a slight movement in the corner of her eye. 4 figures emerged from the shadows, hands in the air. They were young men, their faces pale in the moonlight. One by one, they climbed out of the pit. "What are you doing on my property?" Jane demanded, her voice stern. The men exchanged nervous glances. Jane could tell they were amateurs, probably local kids looking for a thrill. One of the boys, the tallest among them, took a tentative step forward. "Miss Jane," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't mean no harm," the boy quickly added, raising his hands in surrender. Jane's eyebrows furrowed. "Then, what were you doing on my property in the middle of the night?" Can we sit down and explain?" one of them asked, his voice tremulous. Jane's first instinct was to refuse. She nodded, her grip on the bat relaxing slightly. "Let's go to the porch," she said, her voice stern but softer. As they took their seats, Jane noticed the palpable guilt on their faces. They were just kids. They reminded her of her own nephews. "So," she prompted, her gaze falling on the tallest boy, who seemed to be their leader. The boys hesitated before one of them started to speak. "We live a few miles down the road, ma'am," the boy said. His voice carried a soft country drawl. "Our families ain't got much, and we mostly make do with whatever jobs we can find. We just We just wanted to," one of the boys stammered, his voice trailing off. The tallest boy finally broke the silence. "Can we tell you a story, ma'am?" he asked, his voice just above a whisper. He looked at Jane. Jane was skeptical but nodded in agreement. "Ma'am, we didn't mean no harm." The tallest boy began, his voice barely a whisper, trembling with emotion. "Our mama, she's been really sick for a long while. It's been months since she's been able to get out of bed. She loves flowers, always used to have some by her bedside, but we ain't got the money to buy 'em for her every day." It was a scenario far from anything Jane had imagined. "She loves roses, ma'am," the second boy chimed in. "She always talks about how roses can lift her spirits, make her forget the pain for a while. We knew about your garden, about the beautiful roses you have. We thought if we could just get her some, she could have some happiness, even if it's just for a little while." She felt a surge of sympathy for these boys, who were only trying to bring some joy to their ailing mother. One of them began, hesitating. "We wanted to plant a rose bush for her, to have our own flowers, so we wouldn't have to steal anymore. We were going to put it back, I swear, once we had a bush of our own." Jane was silent, the boys' confession and the picture of their desperate situation sinking in. Tears welled in her eyes, the gravity of the boys' situation hitting her. This was the first time in a long time she felt a connection to the outside world, a bond born out of compassion and shared hardships. Taking a deep breath, Jane wiped her tears and stood up. "Boys," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "from now on, you don't need to sneak around. You can come and pick roses for your mother anytime you want, and I'll help you plant a rose bush for your mother." Their eyes widened, surprise etched on their young faces. "Really, Miss Jane?" the tallest boy asked. The obvious sound of confusion and awe was audible in his voice. Jane nodded, her eyes welling up again. A collective sigh of relief passed among the boys. They thanked her profusely, their eyes shining with gratitude and relief. From that day forward, Jane's solitary life was no longer. She found herself welcoming the boys into her home, her garden, and her life. She became a source of support for them, and in return they became her unlikely companions. Her garden, once a symbol of her solitude, was now a beacon of love, kindness, and shared understanding. In reaching out to these boys, Jane had found something she hadn't realized she was missing: a connection, a sense of purpose, and most importantly, friends.